Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Sheri Chaney Jones to talk about measuring your impact. Sheri, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. I'm excited to be here.
So, I am very curious to know your superhero origin story.
Absolutely. I have always been a curious child, loving to try to understand the world around me. So I think I was using data and numbers and research before I really even understood the scientific method. I have, great memories of me as a kid, trying to figure out the drug problem in my school. Not that there was a big one, but I did this research project where I was looking at seniors' perspectives of the drug problem versus eighth graders. As a high schooler, now looking back, I think that's a little curious. Most high schoolers don't say, hey, that's what I want to do for a project, but just I've always been really fascinated with how do we use data to predict performance, but specifically to advance social causes and solve complex social problems.
Yeah, I mean, the data driven approach is one of my favorite approaches of all time because it's logical, it's numbers. I know some people can play with numbers and especially statistics, which I can never pronounce
Mhm.
that word correctly for some reason, but we'll talk about that going forward.
Yeah.
These days, I know you have an organization. If you could maybe just give a bit of background on what you do today and, how is it
Yeah.
that you know what you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did leverage that curiosity into a formal career track. I studied industrial and organizational psychology in college, have a master's degree in that from Central Michigan University. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been working when I was a government funder for about 10 years, where I was looking at the impact of the grants that we were making into the nonprofit sector and helping really define what we should be measuring, how we should be measuring things, how do we report that back up to, our funding bodies, which typically were the state legislature or the federal government. And, really was perfecting the craft, early on before impact measurement was really talked about. I was in these roles evaluating the impact of the work. And in 2010, after serving with the Ohio Department of Aging, and we were able to use data to save $250 million in Medicaid and get all of our money back from the state legislature in the, I think most people say in our common economic history, the Great Recession was a very, very difficult time for government and nonprofits alike. I decided to leave and jump into the world of entrepreneurship. Started a company called Measurement Resources, which is an organizational development and research firm. And we were helping that same sector, nonprofit government organizations, use data to solve complex social problems. And through that work, our customers came to us and said, we love the insights your firm's providing us. What technology should we be using to help automate, how we're tracking and measuring and communicating our impact? So that then led me to launch Sure Impact, which is an online cloud-based tool that really helps nonprofits have their impact insights at their fingertips.
Awesome. 25 million in Medicaid. That's a significant achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, it was. We were always saving that much money. We just needed to prove it. And that's kind of,
Exactly.
I think, most nonprofits and social service agencies, I think across the world are contributing huge savings to taxpayer dollars and public savings. It's really about how do you quantify that and tell your story and unlock that. I'm going to borrow something from a recent friend of mine. She talked about the renaissance of relevance. And so I feel like that's what we're doing. We're unlocking the ability for nonprofits to really communicate their relevance in a much larger way than beyond just, hey, we do good work, so why don't you write us a check?
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing too with my clients, my nonprofit clients, in that they do great work, but they don't always know the impact that they have, or they have a hard time gathering the numbers. Data is scattered. So obviously having it in one source of truth is fantastic, or aggregated to a source of truth is fantastic. To be able to say, hey, look, here's provable numbers, here's how we're actually measuring up, and here's how we're impacting. It seems like a no-brainer, but it almost is more often than not a secondary goal as opposed to we just need to do things and then
Mhm.
figure out how well we're doing things.
Yeah. No, and you're spot on. I did kind of in my journey, my origin story. I didn't mention when I was making that transition from state government to starting my own firm, I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was launch an unfunded market research study because back then I just thought of myself as, a researcher and a bureaucrat. And that there was also the findings I published in a book called Impact and Excellence back in 2014. But that's exactly what I was looking at. I was looking at why were the nonprofit sector in particular not adopting these data-driven strategies when we had research that showed when they do, they were more likely to win more grants, raise more money, and really scale and grow their impact. And, we found a few interesting things. We found that there was, what the perception of why people didn't do it was they didn't have enough time, they didn't have enough money, they didn't have enough staff, and they didn't have enough expertise. But my myth buster was that there was no correlation between an organization's size and budget and their ability to create these high performing data driven cultures. And the number one factor that predicted their success was really the willingness and the commitment of leaders at the organization. And so we kind of built our whole, whether it's how we built the technology or how the consulting services do our work, it's really removing, those other barriers which are related to time and not know like the know-how. We can train people up. We can, create technology that crunches the numbers and does all the data analytics for them to take away the hard. But really it comes down to, does leadership buy into the importance of being data-driven?
So you kind of skimmed across what I was thinking about next is, I love data-driven decisions, but not everyone might fully appreciate the why. Like, what is different about data-driven decisions as opposed to, I guess, what would be the opposite of that? Emotional decisions or,
Yeah.
first thoughts or
Anecdotal. Yeah.
anecdotal? Yeah, I mean, there must be a better word for it. But, what is so special about it? You mentioned a couple of them, but I was hoping you could really just go a bit deeper on that answer.
Yeah, I think, well, we all have our, of course we think about things because of our emotion, and nonprofits are no different, right? Whether it's your donors or your funders, they're going to care about your organization because of your mission and the stories that you tell. But we definitely rationalize our behavior with our brain. So if for specifically we're talking to a funder is going to have better bonding, if you will, to your nonprofit if they feel like their investment is going towards a reputable, sophisticated, data-driven organization. So that's kind of why on the external side of things, you want to be data-driven, is because you're going to bond your stakeholders to you because they're going to feel better about their gift, right? Once the emotion wears off, they're going to have this rational side of it that says, you know what, my investment is going to a sophisticated organization that's monitoring their data, that's ensuring my investment is going to make the impact that I want to make. From an internal perspective, though, and this is the less sexy part, but it's also the part that drives my passion. I mentioned, doing this work before anyone else was doing it. And my first job as I was working at the juvenile courts and was asked to evaluate their programming. And we found through evaluation that one of our programs was actually making kids worse. We were increasing the likelihood that they would go back into our juvenile justice system than if we just sent them home and
Wow.
said, don't do it again, and sent them home. Now, of course, no one at the court wanted to do this. This was not the desired outcome. And yet that has formed my very early worldview on why this work is so important. Because if we say we have a mission, if we say this is the change we want to see in the world, and we're not measuring it, how can we manage to it? And how can we, scale it and grow it and make sure that the programs that we're doing are the most effective ones to deliver that change we're looking to see?
So for the external one, I mean, I'm happy you mentioned it exactly that is because we say we're rational people, but we're actually emotional people first.
Yeah.
And then we justify our emotions by rationalizing them. That's just the way we're built. So it sounds like if you can speak to both sides of it, the emotional side and the rational side of your funders and other people, get the story going. Of course, it's very important, the cheerleading happening, but then back it up with numbers and saying, look, here's actually what we're doing. That to me seems like a 1-2 combo punch that is really effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And our data says, like, really proves that. So the nonprofits who have no data but just great stories, 18% of those have recorded increased revenues in the last 2 years. Those who have data with their stories, 68% of them have
Wow.
increased their revenues in the last 2 years. So if I was a betting person, I want to be among the 68% have increased their revenues in the last 2 years versus the 18%.
That is a significant jump. And it makes,
Yeah.
rational sense to me. But it's nice to have those kinds of numbers to back up. Again, it's not anecdotal, it's science data driven.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then for the internal side of things, I mean, exactly that, knowing if a program works or not. I don't know why, but the first thing that popped into my head was this movie, and I forget the name of it, but it was about McDonald's, the early days of McDonald's,
Oh, the
where
Ray Kroc story.
I think that was it. It was
Yeah.
on Netflix or I don't know. But the idea they
Yeah.
had so many menu items and the business was floundering. And so when the new person came in, they did an analysis of, what are the best selling items? And it was just burgers and fries. So they
Hmm.
basically, or maybe milkshakes too, I don't know, something very, very minimal, like a
Yeah.
tenth or something of the original menu. And so they just wiped off 90% of the menu to focus on those items. And all of a sudden, things started really turning around. It sounds similar to what you were saying now in the sense of the ability to have data driven impact is you're able to see where the fat is, where you can trim fat, where you can optimize, where you can pivot. And you're right, the results might not be what you're expecting. It might be the opposite of what you're expecting. But that's the beauty of data driven decisions is that it's not based on what I think it should be. It's here's what the data shows, here's the evidence
Hmm.
for it, and therefore we need to make some adjustments because it's clear that it's not working or it's not working as well as we would like it to.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, I love the elegance of when we find things like this is working. And if we can, pull this lever, we're going to see so much greater change. So an example of that is there is a group we were working with called Pathlight Home. They provide supportive housing to individuals experiencing homelessness. And because of the way they were funded, some of their residents received wraparound case management support, and other of their residents just received kind of the housing subsidy or the rent subsidy. And because they were collecting, we might talk more about this later, but the three types of data that are really important for nonprofits to collect, they knew that when their residents had that wraparound case management services, they were 2.5 times more likely to have a successful retention rate in the housing or a non-unfavorable outcome. I know that's kind of backwards, but anyway, they had successful housing outcomes. So with that 2.5, knowing that they were 2.5 times more likely, they were able to go to private foundations for those residents who did not have the case management. And they went to people like the Disney Foundation and these other private foundations, and they were able to secure the resources. So now all of their residents can have case management, increasing their success rate. And since their, outcomes or their desired mission is to keep people stably housed and have access to affordable housing, they can prove how, this extra investment was going to achieve those goals.
That is awesome. Yeah, you now you scratched my interest, of course. What are the three types of data to collect?
Sure. Yeah. So we believe every nonprofit should have three types of data. The first is, who do you serve? So better understanding of, the demographic characteristics of the people you serve. So, who they are, where they come from. And the reason that's important is because we need to make sure we're creating equitable outcomes. So a little bit about who we're serving. Then what do you do with them? So what services do you offer? And that's the dose, not just what do you do, but the dose. Like, for example, how many case management hours for this particular story I just shared. And then the third is how are those people better off on those key outcomes that your nonprofit is trying to achieve. You don't need hundreds of them, but you just want a few elegant ones that really communicate your story. And what's really critical though is that you need that through when you're, thinking about data collection. If you really want to take a data-driven approach, you need to structure your data so you can understand who is being served, what you're doing with them, and how they're better off, so that you can make really powerful data-driven decisions.
Yeah, that really covers. I'm looking at my notes, and I think those are the three. I don't even know if I could add. I can't add to that because that exactly is that. And I like the idea of having just a select number of stories to share because obviously people can get overwhelmed with stories. But choosing your priceless ones are great. So to get this kind of data, to collect it, you need to measure it. And I was wondering if there's like sometimes nonprofits can get overwhelmed or underwhelmed with data, just having data at all, deciding if something is worth tracking in a system at all, whether it's your system or a CRM or any other kind of
Yeah.
system. I remember when I do certain consulting, for example, people ask, we want to have this field that tracks this and that field that does that. And I said, well, sure, we can do it, but what are we going to use it for? Like, are we actually going to build a report at some point that's going to use it? And it's like, oh no, the ED just wants it for their own interests. And that's like, all right, well, it sounds great, but if we're not actually going to do something with this data, it's going to overwhelm people. It's going to pollute the signal to noise. You're going to, have people who are going to be less likely to enter all the other really important data because they're entering
Mhm.
this extra superfluous data.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess the question I'm trying to come up with is there an approach or a strategy for, here are things that we should strongly consider keeping track of, and here are things that you probably don't need to. How do we make that determination as we're going along?
Mhm. Yeah. So I think some of the foundational tools that we use before saying, okay, this is what you should track is one, I'm a huge proponent of logic models. And I know that's in some circles, nonprofits think that's a dirty word, but it's not if done correctly. And the reason why I call myself a logic model lover is because that is giving you one piece of paper that really lets you see what is unique about your organization, what makes it special and different, who do you serve and what do you do with them, and what are those short and medium term outcomes that you hope to achieve through your intervention. So once you have that kind of laid out on one piece of paper, then I think adding metrics and numbers to it becomes so much easier. But if you just start off with a conversation of like, what are we going to measure? That's the universe is too broad. It can be too overwhelming, to your point. And you just start throwing things in and think, well, wouldn't it be interesting if? But when you start with this logic model, now oh, if we want to prove our nonprofit's theory of change, or if we want to prove that this is who we serve, this is what we do with them, and this is how it leads to this change in the world, now we can stop adding all these extras that don't show up in our theory of change. So I think that's a really good grounding exercise and experience to keep us focused on what really matters and what is critical to measure.
Yeah, I was going to use the word algorithm instead of logic models, but they're basically the same kind of thing. The idea is it's a
Yeah.
framework to use, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's a dirty word at all. Maybe I'm an engineer and a bit geeky in that respect, but I think it's a
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
great intersection of psychology and engineering to be able to say, here is a mathematical way of approaching the situation, which is, time tested, proved, and so forth. And it eliminates some of the bias or reduces maybe some of the bias along the way as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, because I remember like one example is the client wanted to track age or the birth date specifically of the person, and they never actually used the data. Just because they could track age doesn't mean they should track age or birth dates. So that
Mm-hmm.
was like, if you're not serving that, or if you're not serving a certain age demographic, then maybe there's less um, usefulness in doing it. And I think it's to your point of, as long as you go back to who are you serving, and as long as those criteria falls into your demographics, it's worth it. And if it's not, it's not.
Yeah, yeah. Like if you have a theory of change that says, for example, when I was working at the Department of Aging, well, age was a little bit important for us because we needed to understand, you know, um, how we were. We had a mission statement that was promoting choice, independence, and quality of life for all aging seniors. So we wanted to make sure we were keeping people thriving in their own homes and in community-based care. So understanding, where interventions or what programs were working for different population groups was really key to us. But if it's not critical to your mission, then to your point, don't ask.
And would that be the answer to the same question of, because I like asking sometimes a positive question and a negative question, but not
Mhm.
as in emotional, but just like the two sides of the coin. In
Yeah.
terms of ignoring data, like if you're collecting all this data, but some of it can be ignored or maybe even removed, is there a particular formula for that as well, or is it just the opposite of what we should be tracking?
No, I think removing data is a really great thing, right? Data is a means to an end. And if you don't know how you're going to use a specific data point, then you really should ask yourself, why are we collecting this? I think that's a great exercise to do and say, what are we going to do with this? When in our processes, we ask like, once you know this, how's it going to just drive either performance conversations or, in your fundraising and storytelling? And if there's not an answer for those two questions, then you really should ask yourself, should we be collecting it?
Okay. And not everything is easily measured. I mean, age obviously is something very easy to number, dates, amounts. These are very easy things to do. What about
Yeah.
something that's a bit more intangible? So organizations, for example, who are helping, I know a few that I've been talking to recently who are helping kids and women in particular be able to be more empowered,
Mhm.
or have more confidence. How do you measure success on that? I mean, you can measure how many people have gone through the program, for
Yeah.
example, but is there any way of measuring something intangible like a confidence or feelings?
Yeah. And I think yes, the answer is yes. And that's where my background as an industrial and organizational psychologist really has helped me with helping nonprofits think about how do we quantify the intangible. Because, that's a whole field of psychology that has been measuring things like confidence and empathy and self-sufficiency and, grit and, all these things that people think are intangible, but there's actually, not to get really geeky, but there's psychometric tools and properties to properly assess these constructs. And we live in an information age, so finding validated open source scales and tools is not very difficult to go in and find what's been tested in the research and the literature to measure these types of skills. Now, your audience members might be thinking, or the listeners might be thinking, well, that's self-report. How can we trust self-report data when we're talking about impact and outcomes? And at least for your US listeners, I'm not sure if you do this in Canada as well, is that we hold a census every 10 years and have short ones every couple years. And what is that? That's essentially a survey, self-report survey. So there's plenty of press, and that's scientifically validated. So there's tons of, I guess, research or experience of things where we're using survey data to make decisions.
Yeah, surveys for sure. And I think what it's important to note is it doesn't need to be 100% accurate. Like there are in these surveys, you usually have like a margin of error, right? We're
Yeah,
90% complete, sort of, we believe with 90% accuracy that it's this, but there's a margin of error of plus or minus 2 percentage points. So at least you have an idea. It's an order of magnitude as compared to the, say, 20%. You know more or less what you're dealing with.
yeah.
It might be 88, might be 92, but at least you know more or less where things are on the map.
Ab-
Um,
ab- yeah, absolutely. And I think it's more scientific than, asking three people what their
right.
experience is. Like that anecdotal story may sway, you may sway your programming because you're either catering to like the super positive or the super negative, where if you have at least some systematic way to standardize this data, you're going to be able to have those good reliability, I would say.
I remember when I was doing UX evaluations, like when you're testing basically your new interface, you don't need to test it with every single possible user that's going to use your system. There's a certain sample size that you need to get like 80% accuracy. And I forget the exact numbers and the ratio, but the idea is, and to make up some numbers along the way, right? If you have a 10,000 people that you need to survey, if you can only survey 100 of them, like there are some numbers that say, if you can sample 100, that's going to be accurate enough to represent the remaining 10,000 as long as you
Yeah.
follow certain criteria. You don't need to get 1,000 or 5,000 to get the 10,000, but of course you don't want to do, to your point, you don't want to have one or two people because that's not
Yeah.
enough sample size. So
Yeah.
that's an important call out to make, so that don't feel like you have to knock on everybody's door to complete that survey.
Yeah, there's a really great analogy I like to use when kind of helping people understand, how many people do I need to survey, or what does my survey size need to be? And the analogy I use is if you were making some chili for a block party in your neighborhood, whether you're making chili for a block party or you're making chili for your family, you use the same size spoon. So survey sampling is similar, whereas whether you're wanting to know the whole entire population of a state or, a small nonprofit population base, at some point, and the magic number is typically around 400, you've kind of reached that saturation.
So in terms of surveys then, self-reported surveys, do you think that by itself is enough to cover all the intangibles, to measure the intangibles? Is there any other supplementary or alternatives than surveys?
I think that a balanced measurement approach is best. And so what that looks like is, again, we talked about more of the things you can count, like how many people are you serving, what did you do with them? Then if you are measuring these constructs such as confidence or, change in, one's perception of wellness or things like that, surveys is how you're going to capture that data. But then if you can go to the next level and measure some sort of, whether it's behavioral change or reduction in a behavior, that's also going to add to the layer of sophistication of your data collection. So that could be things like they actually got a new job, or you have, basically, a pay stub that shows increase in income, or, with students, they took a test and now they have improved skills on a validated assessment. So it's that combination of having like some of my scientist friends would say it was quantitative data or qualitative data, but in a systematic, structured way with that behavioral evidence as well. And that makes for, that's kind of the gold star. That's the absolute next level.
That makes sense. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure, hopefully, listeners by now will say, okay, data driven definitely is the way to go. Here's the importance of it. Here's the value of it. Here's some of the benefits of it. I'm curious to know then, how can organizations or executives start building more of a culture that is accepting of and wants to find more data? Like, how do we change, or do we need to change mindsets of people to say, look, now that we know how it is, here's how we can get the whole organization on board and adopt this kind of model to say, we are a data-driven organization?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, the number one predictive factor is the commitment and willingness of the leader. And so I know that sounds simple. It's not like if you're an executive director listening, you're like, all right, today we are data-driven. So it is. But in some ways, I'm laughing, but it can be that easy if you're committed to the journey. And some of the ways to make sure that you keep committed to that journey is a culture reinforcement. So, for example, with our platform, we have, every 4 hours, people are getting refreshed information, refreshed dashboards, refreshed data related to their impact. So that kind of constant visualization, constant seeing of that information is a way to reinforce that this is important to our organization. Nothing kills a data-driven culture than asking people to collect information and they never see the results of it. They never hear it being talked about. They never, it just goes somewhere in a black box and no one knows what anyone does with it, because that then will make people in the organization devalue it, think it's not important. So the more as a leader you can talk about data, share the information, ask people, what does this mean for you, is really important. And another point I want to make related to data and just its underlying truth is that there's a lot of fear around it. People are afraid that they'll find that they'll learn that they're not doing as well as they think they are. And although no one really will speak about it out loud, that is definitely a fear that people have, is that fear of judgment, or what if I learn that, things aren't working well? And so creating a positive culture of continuous improvement and not, punitive or judgment is so critical to have people embrace and adopt a data-driven culture.
And I would strengthen that message actually, because I've seen and heard from people who say the exact same thing. If you can measure the fact that you're not doing so well and you're transparent about it, and you're saying, here's how our plan, or here is our plan to get better, and maybe we need more guidance from certain stakeholders or the board. The idea is that transparency is very valuable. It's touching. People connect with it, because it isn't always unicorns and rainbows. There are moments where the program maybe isn't doing so well, but as long as you're, again, self-improving, you're iterating and making these improvements along the way, that is almost more important than starting off. I can't say starting off from the right foot, but at least it's more important than just sitting there or hiding the data. There you go. It's definitely more important than hiding the data.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've seen investors time and again rather fund and invest in a nonprofit who, might come with them and say, hey, my success rate is 62%. And we've learned that, if we add these wraparound services to our, programming, it's going to increase our costs, but it's also going to increase our success rate by 5 to 10%. They would rather invest in that organization than the one that's just like, doesn't they, they're going to turn around and ask the other organization they're considering to fund, and what's your success rate? And when that leader's like, oh, I don't know, we serve a thousand kids, the more data-driven organization is going to win every single time.
And speaking of stakeholders and board members, I was curious to know if you have any tips or suggestions on how to communicate all of this great data back to them in a sense that I know back in the day, infographics was a really big thing. I don't really see that anymore. But I
Yeah.
know that you want to keep it obviously bite-sized, summary level to certain individuals. Is there any best practices these days on how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably people that who are going to speak much more eloquently on marketing tactics than I am. But I think that just those three pieces of data, what did you do, how well did you do it, and how people are better off, and very succinct buckets, tells a really great story, add, a case study, add a pretty picture. And I also, one of my favorite measures of communicating impact is this concept of cost per success. So instead of cost per service, which I think people are good at telling, but that's not a great measure, because then all you have, in order to be more successful, you have to do more with less. But the cost per success measure is basically taking your total program or organization budget, dividing it by the number of people that you have successful outcomes for. And now what you're reporting back is, this is how much it costs to get one person to a successful outcome, which is essentially what the funder is buying. So you're being realistic with them and saying, hey, if you're interested in affordable housing, it's costing us, $1,500 or $5,000 or whatever the numbers come out to be to get one person successfully housed. It paints a realistic picture on what it takes, and then it helps that investor know, or that funder know, the percentage of that outcome their investment is contributing to.
I love it. Cost per success is fantastic, and it's a very positive outlook as well too,
Mm-hmm.
which I think strengthens that as well. I'm going to take a note of that one. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about data these days, especially big data, without talking or mentioning at least AI, because that's what AI
Mm-hmm.
consumes, right? Is data and does stuff with it. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to know, in this data-driven world of I would say architecture. That's what I do, data-driven architecture. But in this world of data-driven organizations and successes and this and that, what is the role of AI these days in that?
Yeah, so that's something that, us, we're at Sure Impact, are really excited about in the future, being able to help nonprofits leverage AI to have that kind of predictive modeling, if you will. So you can, especially with the launch of like ChatGPT and this generative AI, everyone now has this concept of AI in terms of, I think, language and being able to write things for us or quickly search things. But we've been using AI all along in terms of machine learning and predictive modeling, and better understanding that, we're seeing patterns related to these people who have these conditions, when, receiving these interventions, are more likely to achieve these outcomes. And that's the vision, and that's the future that Sure Impact wants to be a part of, is helping nonprofits be smarter. I think in healthcare, definitely in marketing, in so many other fields, we're so much more evolved with, kind of accepting and using AI and predictive modeling to make decisions with big data sets. But because the nonprofit sector is so far behind in actually consistently measuring, those three pieces of data that I talked about, I think we're gonna have to wait a while until we can start to see those innovations in the nonprofit ecosystem. But we're excited to be part of that story.
I mean, it's normal for nonprofits to be a bit lagging, let's call it, behind
Mm-hmm.
technology, but just because they can't take as many risks as other companies can. But
Yeah.
the idea is that, yeah, there's a lot of power and availability to them when they get there. And you're right, we've been using predictive generation, what do you call it? Predictive models and generative models to be able to analyze and understand and make predictions from that. So nothing to
Yeah.
do with the chat GPT, which is types you. It's all the other data crunching and summarizing that is so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably an aside, but I was at a conference probably I don't know, 10 years ago now. And someone introduced themselves to me as a data scientist. I was like, oh, that's really cool. What's that? And they explained it to me. And I realized, oh, I'm a data scientist. I'm just so old. I didn't know that's what it's called.
That is a popular term these days. Yeah. So listen, this has been awesome, Sheri. I was wondering if you could share with people a bit more how to get in touch with you. How can they learn more about Sure Impact? Any social media you would like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love everyone to check out Sure Impact, SURE impact.com. You'll find, addition to more information about our product, but we have a host of on-demand webinars, guides on how to create impact measurement cultures and impact-centric culture. So a lot of, educational pieces as well as learning more about our product. I also am very active on LinkedIn. I would love to connect with anyone there. Just look up Sheri Chaney Jones. Say, hey, I heard you on Alex's podcast, and I'd love to connect and continue the conversation.
Awesome, Sheri. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
You're very welcome. This has been a fun conversation.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.